Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to stand here today on side opposition to debate the resolution this House believes that China will own the 21st century for literally the umpteenth time. Now, what we're going to be doing today on side opposition is going to prove that China will not own the 21st century because it has an extremely unsustainable society, both economically, politically, and socially, and that it doesn't have the ability to set the global agenda. When we talk about global agenda, what we're going to be referring to is the priority of issues that are discussed on the international stage. And what we see today is that the USA dominates the global agenda in almost every international forum. What we're also going to be proving is why the increasing multipolarity of today's globalized world will also prevent China from owning the century. Before we go into all of that, I'm going to clash with statements made by the proposition case. Now, the first speaker today came up and presented two pillars, that of economic dominance and that of social influence. So I'm going to tackle the first pillar on four fronts, that of economic dominance, that of the current strength, sustainability, education, and research. So what they told us today was that China's really powerful currently. What we would say is that if you actually look at their GDP per capita, that they're actually ranked 117th in the world. So we don't actually think that per capita that they're that much of an influence. And what we're also going to be talking to you today, moreover in our entire case, but I'm going to address this briefly, is that of the growth rate, that of the decreasing growth rate, that of the growth rate that's not keeping up. Now what we saw last year is that per quarter, China's growth rate decreased by 0.5%. Each year there's 4 quarters. What we would say is that they're decreasing their growth rate by 2% every year. We think that this growth rate is unsustainable. We don't think that when China has an unsustainable growth rate that they're going to be growing to a state of being the dominant power. Now I'd like to talk about the sustainability of economic dominance for China. Now what they told you today was that in the year 2018 the IMF predicts that China's economy will be #1. What they failed to tell you further is that that same prediction predicts that India will surpass China in the year 2020, 2 years later after China becomes #1 and remain there for the rest of the century. So we don't actually think that prediction that they come up with today actually stands. What we're also going to be telling you later on in our second pillar, that of lack of sustainability, is that China's economy, society, politics is completely unsustainable, so we don't actually think that their pillar is going to stand at all. Then they came up to you and talked to you about education. What we would say is that China's learning system is extremely rigid. You learn by rote. You learn by memorizing things. You don't learn by thinking outside the box, by being creative. So we don't actually think that there's going to be as much creation, as much development as there is in countries such as the USA. What we'd also say is that 25% of graduates from universities in China are unemployed. We don't actually see this as being a good thing when you have a quarter of your newly graduated population being unemployed. So we don't actually think that the education there is going to allow them to be #1. What we also talk about now is research, and they really talk to you about how Chinese society is going to move forward through research. What my partner said in his POI was that really, if you actually look at it, there's censorship in that country. That you can't have free knowledge everywhere. You can't have knowledge be paramount when you have censorship in that country. But what we're also going to say is that currently there's still more patents filed by countries like the USA, like Germany, than China does, and that China is filing way fewer patents than the USA and Germany combined. Now, the second pillar was that of influence. And what we would say is that when they talk about economic power as a buyer and as a seller, that the declining population that we're going to present later on in our case is going to stop that economic power from becoming political power. And what they also did was assert that political influence comes from a strong economy, and we're going to prove that later on in our pillar. So what are our 3 pillars today? Well, firstly, the inability to set the global agenda. #2, the lack of sustainability. And thirdly, multipolarity. So I'm going to move into our first contention, that of China's inability to set the global agenda. So why is this? Well, A, we would say is that the international community won't let China set the global agenda in the first place, and secondly, China itself isn't willing to set the global agenda either. So firstly, why is the international community unwilling to allow China to set the global agenda? What we would say is that it happens on really a very large front, that of China's poor human rights record. We would say is that the international community has condemned China's actions on Tibet, on censorship, on torture, and many other human rights violations for a long time. What we'd also say is that when you have a poor human rights record, that it really prevents China from owning the century in one of 3 ways. Firstly, in many cases, the international community is going to force discussion with China about human rights rather than financial, political, or military issues. Secondly, the United States poses 9 economic sanctions on China solely based on their poor human rights record. And thirdly, countries are not going to allow China to set the global agenda when they don't respect the rights of their own people. Now, the second main idea of this pillar is that China doesn't even want to own the 21st century. What we would say is that in their foreign policy, China explicitly states that it will not interfere with the internal affairs of other countries. And because of this, they've consistently expressed introvert political decisions, such as failing to aid Syria in the United Nations. So how does this affect China's ability to own the century? What we would say is that obviously if China is unwilling to actually own the century in the first place, then they're not going to own the century. Now, the second pillar, that of the lack of sustainability, and this is really going to topple the first 2 points. Now, this pillar is really split into 2 main ideas, that of demographics and that of economy. Now, the first main idea is that of this, lack of sustainability in demographics. Now, currently, China has 1.3 billion people. But the United Nations predicts that in 90 years, by the end of the century, China's population will drop by 400 million people to 900 million people. Just 1 second. So what we would say is that when you have a declining population, then you're going to have stunted economic growth, and you're going to have stunted foreign direct investment.
Okay, as we've said, in the future, China's economy is going to move to research. This means that they don't need that many people to support a blooming economy. Don't you agree, sir? Yeah, but in your second pillar, you said that political influence comes from economic power as a buyer and a seller. You can't buy things when you have a declining population because you're not going to be as attractive in foreign direct investment. You can't sell as many things because you can't produce as many things because you have a declining working population. So we think that you've just really completely backstabbed yourself on taking down your own second pillar. So what's actually causing the severe decline in population? That answer is the one-child policy. Now, with this one-child policy, the substantial majority of the population can't have more than 1 child. This means that when the current generation of the working population leaves and retires, there's going to be half as many of them to fill their places. Then, thus, China's working population will consistently decline. Now, why is this a bad thing? Well, as I already mentioned, corporations invest in China because of its large consumer base and because of its large working population. So let's first address the population problem, protected time, that of the declining working population. 44% of China's GDP is based upon the manufacturing industry. Obviously, you take out the working population down by 400 million people over the next 90 years, you're going to have much less manufacturing capabilities. You're not going to be that attractive to corporations. Secondly, with a decreasing overall population, China's consumer base is also going to go down, which means that once again, corporations are less likely to invest in China. Now let's talk about China's economic slowing growth. Foreign direct investment from the United States dropped by 26% in the year 2011. China's economic growth decreased by 0.5% each quarter in the year 2011. Obviously, their economic growth is unsustainable. Now, it's also projected that China's economy, as I said before, is going to become #1 in 2018, but they're not going to be #1 for more than 2 years. So we think that statistically, on every basis, China does not have a sustainable economic system, that because they're not sustainable, that they can't, Grace please, that they can't own the century, that they can't get more power, that they can't own the century politically, socially, or economically. Thank you.